Good morning. I'm Robert White, Council Member at Large and Chair of the Committee on Housing. Today is Thursday, November 2nd, 2023, and we're meeting in room 412 of the John A. Wilson Building. The time is now 10:04 a.m., and I'm calling to order this public roundtable. Today, we are meeting to discuss resolutions PR 25-448 and PR 449, which would confirm the reappointments of Johanna Shreve as Chief Tenant Advocate in the Office of the Tenant Advocate and Lauren Pear as Rent Administrator in the Department of Housing and Community Development. First, the committee will consider the reappointment of Chief Tenant Advocate Johanna Shreve. Ms. Shreve created the Office of the Tenant Advocate as a temporary division within the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs. She led the office to become an independent agency in 2007 and has served as the Chief Tenant Advocate since that time. Throughout that time, Chief Tenant Advocate Shreve has been a powerful voice for tenants at the council while also building the capacity of OTA to serve the needs of tenants in the community. Director Shreve's experience in housing policy extends well before the establishment of OTA, going back to her work with the National Corporation for Housing Partnership starting in 1978. Since that time, she has also worked at the DC Public Housing Authority, the National Association of Home Builders, and her own consulting firm on housing policy. As Chief Tenant Advocate, Ms. Shreve is responsible for ensuring that OTA is meeting its mission to provide technical advice and legal services to tenants, to educate and inform the tenant community, and to advocate for the rights and interests of district renters. During today's roundtable, I look forward to discussing with the Chief Tenant Advocate how OTA defines success and how she tracks OTA's performance over time. I also look forward to understanding her plans for the future should the council confirm her reappointment. Next, the committee will consider the reappointment of Rent Administrator Lauren Pear. In the past, the Rent Administrator adjudicated cases related to the Rental Housing Act of 1985. That changed about 20 years ago when council transferred the rent administrator's adjudicatory powers to the newly created Office of Administrative Hearings. Today, the rent administrator is most known for carrying out the district's rent stabilization program, commonly known as rent control. The rent stabilization program has been a critical part of the district's affordable housing landscape. Managing the program is a big responsibility and requires balancing a range of stakeholder interests, including housing providers and tenants. As we saw earlier this year, fluctuations in the market can disrupt this balance. I'm interested in hearing more about Ms. Pear's experience navigating rent control and how she addresses its challenges. The rent administrator also leads the Rental Accommodations Division at the Department of Housing and Community Development. As the division leader, the rent administrator is tasked with setting up a long overdue interagency rent control database system, which will greatly impact how the division works. Ms. Pear has been working on this project for the past 4 years and shared that she intends to see it through. Council has confirmed Ms. Pear's rent administrator appointment twice, first in 2017 and then in 2020. Prior to her appointments, Ms. Pear served as the rental conversion and sale administrator at DHCD for 11 years. In her pre-hearing responses, Ms. Pear shared that her personal career objective is to work in public service. She aims to continue her commitment to service in this role. I look forward to hearing more about Ms. Pear's experience thus far and her goals for her potential reappointment. I don't believe we've been joined by any colleagues at this point, and we have one public witness who will join us virtually. Our government witnesses are in person. So we will now turn to our public witness, Sabrina Williams Bates, President of Delta Towers Tenant Association. As Ms. Bates gets queued up, I will note that Ms. Bates, you will drop out of the hearing momentarily. You'll be brought back in as a witness, at which point you can unmute yourself and present your testimony. You will have 4 minutes to testify. And Ms. Bates, I need you to accept promotion. You should see a button. There we are.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for hearing one of your citizens here of Washington, D.C. I greatly appreciate the City Council taking into consideration my testimony this morning. Um, I just wanted to say, first of all, my name is Sabrina Williams Bates. I am the president of the Delta Tenants Association at the Fortitude of Delta Towers building at 808 Bladensburg Road Northeast. I wanted us to kind of consider, how do we know of great leadership? Well, in my opinion, I feel we know great leadership by those who follow them. When a leader can empower her staff, her followers, to behave in to believe in their abilities to excel and cause others to excel, that's good leadership. When she doesn't feel threatened of losing her position, so much so that she shares all of her knowledge with her staff, that's good leadership. When she plans for them to uh, one day lead also and become their number one cheerleader, that's good leadership. I have worked with Mr. Pugh, Mr. Cristobal Pugh, and Mrs. Nicole McConty. I may be pronouncing that wrong. Please forgive me if I did. For quite a long time. They have come to the Fortitude Delta Towers and worked with the board members and the Tenants Association to establish us in our building. We have a great working relationship with our owners as well as our management. And that is solely due to the assistance of Mr. Cristobal Pugh and Mrs. McIntyre. I'm so sorry. Uh,
No problem.
that to me is a sign of being led by great leadership. These people have helped us to strategize to make our TA the best in DC, and I do want to say I feel we are. These two share their knowledge. They're kind, they're patient, they're consistently available employees of the OTA. Let me, they help to lead me and the people here and the tenants here at the Delta Towers and show that they care about what's going on in our community. That came from Mrs. Shreve's leadership. That is definite. As we see great leaders and we see leaders that are destructive in our society, we know when a destructive leader is there, destruction comes to the people. When a great leader is there, we see a great outcome. And I believe that Ms. Shreve is definitely a great leader because her staff exemplifies professionalism, kindness. And I know sometimes we think that's just a little lost characteristic, but it's a very great one, especially to our senior community that lives here in DC. She created that agency in 2006, and I believe part of her vision was to empower the voices of DC tenants. We want our voice to continue to be heard. We want to continue to grow and to learn to be leaders in our community and believe under Mrs. Shreve's leadership, this will continue to happen in the District of Columbia. I want to thank you. I'm not long winded. I want to thank you for listening to one of your citizens as we are being led by Ms. Shreves and her staff into great leadership positions here in Washington, D.C. We thank you, City Council, for listening to our voice here of the all for the confirmation of Mrs. Shreve for the Office of Tenant Advocacy and for continued voices being heard in DC of their citizens. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us. It is always helpful to have public citizens on the record for confirmation hearing. So I'm particularly grateful for you taking time today. How are things going at Delta Towers?
I think for the most part, because of the classes that were led with the Office of Tenant Advocacy, I believe we are on a great road to success. We have a continued working relationship with our management staff where they meet with us monthly, which is profound considering that DC has no particular tenants association laws, just the laws to organize. So we are very, very blessed that we have that kind of relationship. Yes, are there some issues here at the Delta Towers? Yes, mainly safety issues in the community. And we are working with Mrs. Kathy Henderson to help to solve some of those issues. We're working with our tenants, we're working with our owners, the Deltas, and also for management. So, yes, I would say that we are on the road to growth here at the Fortitude the Delta Towers.
Excellent. And the capacity in which you and others at Delta Towers usually work with the Office of the Tenant Advocate is through trainings and things like that?
We're with trainings, we're with strategizing for the best for our tenants association. And yes, mostly with training. And Mr. Cristobal and Miss McEntee has been here several times when we were forming our board, when we were getting articles of incorporation, all the whole process. They have been available when we have asked for assistance and a little level of guidance. I know they can't tell us what to do, but they help to guide us to the best, how should I say, best conclusions for us as a board and as a tenants association to put forward for our residents here. And they have been so available, which is just amazing with the fact that this is one office that governs all of the tenants association here in DC. We have found them to be extremely available to us. And that's amazing. Very kind and respectful. When you have seniors that are afraid in the community and wanting to do what's right, working with the 5th District Police Station, working with the OTA, working with our, even though Mrs. Henderson is not our particular councilwoman, but she has been a great assistance to us here at the Fortitude the Delta Towers. Yes, that is how they have helped us. And we would not be where we are as a tenants association, we believe, without the Office of Tenant Advocacy and those two representation which we feel is being led by a great late leader, Miss Shreve. We believe that wholeheartedly. We saw Hitler and what he did with his leadership. And I know that may be an extreme viewpoint, but we know destructive leadership can destroy completely. But we believe under Ms. Shreve's leadership, we see progress. We see our voices being heard. We see our senior community understanding that these people coming to our building help to open up our voices and let it be heard in this Ward 5 community. And that is very important to us, especially as we have, worked for years and put it in, paid taxes. And now we still want our voices to be heard. We want to be counted amongst those in DC that want to see DC progress. So thank you.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for being with us and for your testimony today. We now will turn to our government witnesses who we will invite up and swear in. And I want to welcome Chief Tenant Advocate Johanna Shreve and Rent Administrator Lauren Pear. As you know, because you're standing, it is the practice of this committee to swear in our government witnesses. So I'd ask that you raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to provide to the Committee on Housing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you so much. Would you like to do your opening statements back to back or between questions? What's your preference? All right. Well, Ms. Shreve, you can begin when you're ready.
It's on. Good morning, Chairperson White and members of the Committee on Housing. It is good to be with you in person once again at the Wilson Building. I am Johanna Shreve, the Chief Tenant Advocate with the Office of the Tenant Advocate. I wish to thank the Mayor for reappointing me and for her continued confidence in me. And I wish to thank you, Chairperson White, for holding this hearing and closely engaging the OTA on the tenants' community's concerns. I'm happy to have this opportunity to discuss the agency's accomplishments during my tenure as Chief Tenant Advocate, as well as my vision for the OTA's future. I've had the privilege of proudly serving as the district's Chief Tenant Advocate since the OTA was established in 2006. Under my direction, the agency has grown and evolved in each of its core mission areas to become a government agency recognized around the country for the unique and important role it plays. We have pursued our mission with vigor and I believe successfully for 17 years, and we will continue to do so. During my tenure, the agency has created programs to achieve the agency's purposes, help countless thousands of district residents to understand and pursue their rights, and help shape public policy to protect the well-being of tenants in rental housing. I love what I do, and I believe my record shows that I have been pretty good at it too. First, I will discuss a few of the historical accomplishments that I am almost proud of since I became the Chief Tenant Advocate in 2006, along with some more recent successes. One of the agency's most important since the creation in 2006, the Education and Operation Branch has created and continues to refine the core elements of our educational curriculum, specifically presentations such as Renters' Rights 101, Lease 101, What Do You Do If You Find Housing Code Violations in Your Unit, and TOPA classes specifically tailored to building size. E&O receives an ever-increasing number of requests to present on these and other topics to the community, and these requests are coming from increasingly diverse areas throughout the district. E&O has also been instrumental in helping tenants to organize and form tenant associations so they can better advocate for themselves, as you heard this morning from Delta Towers. E&O makes a systemic effort to reach as many tenants as possible, sometimes under challenging circumstances, whether tabling an outreach event in the summer heat, attending a tenant association listening session in an apartment building's laundry facilities, or holding a TOPA class on a building stoop. From FY 2021 through 23, this branch of our agency has participated in a total of 738 events. One of the agency's most important accomplishments during my tenure has been the creation and publication of the DC Tenant Bill of Rights, which became effective in 2015. Housing providers must provide this document to rental applicants and, as a practical matter, generally attach it to the lease at the outset of a tenancy. Ever since 2015, it is evident that tenant awareness of their basic tenant rights and available government resources has expanded significantly. Indeed, E&O makes it a point to disseminate the Tenant Bill of Rights at presentations, particularly in tenant association meetings, and to encourage tenant associations to discuss one or more Tenant Bill of Rights items at their regular meetings. As we can tell from inquiries received over the years, the TBR is regarded as a model document around the country and even in places as remote as Ottawa, Canada. Earlier this year at HUD's request, we presented the TBR at the National Conversation at the Community Table event. Our policy branch is one of the core statutory purposes for the agency's creation, and it serves as a policy voice within the government on behalf of the district's renters. Over the years, key changes to district law that the OTA has either taken a lead on or has substantially assisted in developing include the following: protecting elderly tenants and tenants with a disability, residential lease reform, and the housing conditions calendar. The OTA contributed to the creation of the housing conditions calendar at the DC Superior Court, and the HCC has expanded tenants' access to the court and expedited the resolution of housing condition complaints for almost a decade and a half. We also stay highly engaged on the regulatory front. For example, the OTA has held a seat on the Property Maintenance Technical Advisory Group, the TAG, for the past 12 years. In this capacity, the OTA successfully promoted important tenant rights, including the minimum duration of air conditioning service if it is provided, and preventing an unfair shifting of responsibilities from landlords onto tenants for the cost of pest extermination services. In addition, the Rental Housing Commission incorporated many of the OTA's recommendations into the overhaul of the Rental Housing Act regulations, which took effect as of December 31st, 2021. For example, prior to the rent ceiling clarification legislation, the RHC first proposed rulemaking was substantially consistent with OTA's comments regarding rent concessions and de facto rent ceilings. Judiciously, the OTA has periodically filed amicus curiae briefs to help the court or an administrative body correctly interpret statutes and regulations. In my current term, the council enacted many OTA recommendations to provide and protect renters during the COVID-19 public emergency, including freezes on evictions, landlord eviction filings in court, and notices to vacate, which too often results in tenants self-evicting, thereby mooting the need for due process and a formal eviction action. A freeze on rent increases, pauses on deadlines for tenants to exercise their rights under TOPA and the Rental Housing Act, and a pause on tenant notices of intent to vacate to enable tenants to change their plans due to health concerns and stay in place for the duration of the public health emergency. More recently, the council enacted several OTA recommendations as part of the Eviction Record Ceiling and Fairness in Renting Amendment Act of 2022, which provides more fairness in the rental application process and requires the sealing of eviction records in certain areas and cases so that tenants are not prevented from finding new rental housing due to the scarlet letter of an eviction record. During my tenure, the OTA has assembled a dedicated and talented team of attorneys and paralegals who have responded to countless thousands of requests from district residents for legal advice and guidance. Our reputation in the community is built on our record of helping tenants navigate legal issues and disputes they encounter as renters and helping them get results, including, as I discussed below, monetary compensation in the form of settlement and damage awards. Our intake activity has at times led to large-scale impacts. For example, in 2007, the OTA supported the 4,000 Massachusetts Tenant Association in challenging the largest rent increase request for a capital improvement petition in the district's history. Almost immediately after the OTA appeared as counsel, the housing provider reduced the $14 million petition request by nearly half. In another example, in 2020, the OTA initiated an investigation that culminated in the Office of the Attorney General filing suit against Darrow Management for discriminating against voucher holders and unlawfully denying them opportunities for housing. Darrow was eventually ordered to pay a record-breaking $10 million penalty and dissolve its property management business in the district. The legal branch continues to respond to thousands of intakes each year, providing tenants of the district with free, high-quality legal advice and guidance. Over the last 3 fiscal years, the OTA has assisted 24,537 tenants through brief legal services and online Ask the Director inquiries. In FY23 alone, the OTA recovered helped recover $363,370 for tenants in settlements and damage awards. And since we began tracking these recoveries in 2013, the OTA has returned roughly $24 million to the tenant community. In FY 2009, we created the Emergency Housing Assistance Program in order to augment a pre-existing Red Cross program to step in where voucher assistance was unavailing. Over the last 3 fiscal years, we have deployed the program to temporarily house 900 families in hotels where their units have become uninhabitable due to fire or government closure. The total agency expenditure for emergency housing from 21 through 23 was $1,883,256. For several years, the appropriation for emergency housing has been $550,000. In FY 23, the OTA was given an additional supplement of $340,000, enabling the agency to provide further services after the initial appropriation had run out. I will now discuss a few items that go to my vision for the agency's future. In the legal branch, I intend on increasing the litigation activity of the agency in my next term, particularly once the agency completes its hiring of a new litigation attorney advisor. Due to the lack of affordable legal representation, we believe tenants are particularly underserved in 3 areas of the law: rent control disputes, TOPA violations, and building-wide tenant association matters. With new staff in place, we will be able to increase our litigation portfolio to include representing tenants in these areas. In FY 24, we plan to more aggressively, with the lien authority that the council gave us in 2017, and towards that end have reached out to the Department of Buildings regarding documentation of building closures and the causes of those closures. Prior progress on this matter was stymied in part by novel challenges during the pandemic. Now is the time to move forward. I note that our funding has been more quickly depleted in recent years, in part due to a sharp rise in the number of building closures. The number of building closures increased from 104 in 22 to 134 in FY 23, a 29% increase. And the OTA spent $337,144 on emergency housing for tenants in closure scenarios in FY 23 compared to $199,888 in 22, a 67% increase. Therefore, I would like to explore with the council and DHCD the possibility of modifying the Affordable Housing Preservation Fund such that it could provide grants in addition to loans. The sharp increase in building closures I just noted raises the concern that there are an increasing number of distressed properties for which paying back the loans necessary to remediate may be prohibitive without raising rents. Grants may be more effective than loans at promoting reliable habitability in affected buildings. They could also prove to be more cost-effective over the long term, for example, by obviating the need for future expenditures on emergency housing. The district could require the grant recipient to sign a covenant guaranteeing the long-term affordability of the property. In the educational and outreach branch, I want to expand the reach and effectiveness during my next term. I expect that E&O will increase its number of partnerships with government agencies and community organizations, help create more tenant associations, and increase participation in its tenant association peer mentorship program, and then resume our DC Tenant Summit. Another avenue in particular that I would like the E&O to explore is to potentially train tenant associations to welcome all incoming tenants, including tenants with vouchers, and to help them connect them with any applicable social services, especially ones located in the vicinity of the property. With the Tenant Bill of Rights, now that the raft of the public housing related emergency and temporary laws have expired, the agency, after consulting stakeholders, will finalize and publish its revision to the TBR to reflect several permanent changes and additions to the law since it was published. Thank you, Chairman-Person White, for considering my nomination to serve another term as the Chief Tenant Advocate. I'm available to answer any questions you or other members of the committee may have.
Thank you very much. Ms. Perry, you can begin your testimony. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairperson White and the members of the Committee on Housing. I'm Lauren Pear, the Rent Administrator for the District of Columbia at the Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD, Housing Regulation Administration, Rental Accommodations Division. I appreciate your convening this hearing on my reappointment to serve as a 3-year term as the district's Rent Administrator. I also appreciate Mayor Bowser for reappointing me, and I thank Director Colleen Green and her senior management team for their confidence and support. Thank you as well, Chairperson White, the committee members, and the City Council for your support and confirming me in 2017 and 2020, and for your consideration of my candidacy for a reappointment for a 3rd term. I'm a 46-year resident of the District of Columbia, currently residing in Ward 4. I graduated from Jackson Reed High School, earned a bachelor's degree in international affairs from Tufts University, a master's degree in public administration from the American University School of Public Affairs, and a law degree from the American University Washington College of Law. I began my career as a real estate paralegal, and after graduating from law school, I practiced commercial real estate. After leaving private practice, I was hired at DHCD, working first as the rental conversion and sale administrator for 11 years, and then as rent administrator for the past 6 years. I'm a licensed attorney in good standing with the District of Columbia Bar and the Maryland State Bar. As you know, the rent administrator heads the Rental Accommodations Division called RAD, which is in the Housing Regulation Administration, HRA, of DHCD. HRA also includes the Rental Conversion and Sale Division and the Inclusionary Zoning and Affordable Dwelling Unit Program. RAD administers the Rental Housing Act of 1985, commonly known as rent control. Act's stated legislative purposes are to, 1, protect low and moderate income tenants from erosion of their income from increased housing costs. 2, provide incentives for the construction of new rental units and rehabilitation of vacant rental units. 3, continue to improve administrative mechanisms for resolving disputes between housing providers and tenants. 4, protect the existing supply of rental housing from conversion to other uses. And 5, prevent the erosion of moderately priced rental housing while providing housing providers with a reasonable rate of return on their investments. The Rental Housing Act's key parts are residential rental housing licensing and registration, rent adjustment procedures, rent adjustment petitions and adjudication, and eviction control. These regulatory functions encompass registration, rent adjustment, petition repository management, informal mediation, compliance and enforcement, technical assistance to stakeholders, and community outreach. My charge is to carry out mandates of the Rental Housing Act by providing, among other things, accurate and sound technical advice for our stakeholders and rendering fair and impartial decisions. I wish to give you an overview of my accomplishments from my past 2 terms and my upcoming plans for RAD. The public accessible rent control housing database development, which we call the database. The rent control program needs modernization to facilitate stakeholder transactions, improve RAD efficiency, and implement a robust compliance and enforcement program. RAD operates entirely in paper-based records, which presents considerable challenges, including physical storage, records management, process and procedure, and a paucity of data for fact-based legislative and policy development, ease of use and access by stakeholders, and a reliance on stakeholder self-regulation and compliance. The database represents an opportunity to modernize a 40-plus-year-old regulatory program and digitalize RAD's business processes and workflows. For the past 6 years, my staff and I work closely with the Office of the Tenant Advocate developing the database. It's been a work-intensive process from solicitation and selecting a vendor through development and implementation planning. As you are aware, the rent control program is complex, and translating these statutory and regulatory requirements and workflows into a digitalized business process is challenging. With OTA's transfer of the database to DHCD, the intensive work pace continues. We meet with the database development vendor several times each week. Our work includes providing statutory and regulatory guidance, reviewing workflows and business processes, drafting content for user screens and notifications, and suggesting features to ensure the system is user-friendly. We're currently planning for a pilot program in the coming months. A pilot program launch in the coming months with an eye towards implementation. I'm excited about the prospect of the database and how it will fundamentally change the administration of the Rental Housing Act. The database will change how stakeholders engage with RID, build public confidence, and enhance RID's administration of the Act by providing vital data to assist with fact-based decisions and policy determinations. Legislation and regulations. Legislatively, the past 6 years were quite busy, as you know. With the assistance of RID's attorney advisors, I reviewed and provided comments for 145 pieces of legislative amendments, which were either substantively amended or indirectly impacted administration of the Rental Housing Act. As always, RID endeavors to ensure consistency, clarity, impartiality, and administrability of the law. We also review and commented on 3 sets of regulations by one participating in the Rental Housing Commission's proposed rulemaking for the Rental Housing Act, commenting on the Department of Licensing and Consumer Protections, formerly DCRA, draft Airbnb regulations, and 3, assisting DHC's Housing Preservation Officer with finalizing the District Opportunity to Purchase Act regulations. Administration and operations. I undertook several efforts during my term to improve RID's operations. First, I introduced several enhancements to RID's internal electronic log and FileNut systems, so RID can better track registrations, notices to vacate, rent adjustment notices, petitions, elderly and disabled tenant disclosures, and customer service calls. During the public health emergency, I arranged for RID's registration and rent adjustment FileNet records to be available online for public access and research. Second, I work with the Rental Housing Commission's General Counsel to update and revise many of RID's forms to comply with the Commission's 2021 regulations to update and incorporate recent legislative changes to the Rental Housing Act. The project remains ongoing. Third, at my request, DHCD improved our Housing Resource Center, the one-stop shop for rental housing information and public interface facility. DHCD installed new furniture, renovated the receptionist area, and implemented improved security protocols. Finally, I arranged for training sessions for the RID staff, including fair housing and returning citizens, a tour of the evicted exhibit at the National Building Museum in 2019, risk and safety, and internal training on legislative updates. I also provided RID's attorneys, advisors with an administrative law training opportunity sponsored by the American Bar Association. Outreach. The Rental Housing Act requires that the rent administrator establish working relationships with sister agencies and organizations that impact rental housing regulation. To fulfill that mandate, I work to strengthen and promote relationships with the Office of the Tenant Advocate, the Office of Human Rights, the Rental Housing Commission, the Office of Administrative Hearings, the Landlord-Tenant Branch of the Superior Court for the District of Columbia, the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, now the Department of Buildings and Department of Licensing and Consumer Protection, and the District of Columbia Bar Association. Unfortunately, the public health emergency interrupted the trajectory of my outreach efforts, and the database development consumes a large amount of my staff's capacity. I plan to resurrect RID's calendar of events, teaching facets of rental housing regulation, including registration and licensure, rent adjustments, notices to vacate, and the petitions process. My community outreach participation includes serving as a panelist at OTA's 2019 and 2021 Tenant Summits, meeting with Ward 3 Democrats to discuss the organization's affordable housing and rent control platform, attending New York University Law School's 2019 Forum on Third Generation Rent Control, and co-presenting regulatory updates to the DC Bar in 2022 with the Rental Housing Commission's General Counsel, and recently providing a Rental Housing Act legislative update to the Small Multifamily Owners Association. I am developing plans and objectives for RID, which include modernization. As discussed, I'm planning for the development and implementation of the database. It's vital to RID's functions and responsibilities. RID will train constituents, advertise the new system, recommend needed resources, recommend legislative and regulatory changes to facilitate implementation, and utilize data collection to improve rent and control administration. For forms update, as mentioned, RID recently updated some of its forms, but additional work is required. I will continue working with the Rental Housing Commission to finish RID's forms update, focusing next on notices to vacate and petitions. On compliance and enforcement, RAD will work with DHCD's Office of General Counsel to make compliance and enforcement activities related to the Rental Housing Act more robust. I began my testimony by thanking Mayor Bowser for her consideration and Director Green and her senior staff for supporting my efforts in reappointment. I remain eternally grateful to my village, who give me good counsel and encouragement, including my spouse, parents, and other family members and friends. I also appreciate the advice and support of Chief Tenant Advocate Johanna Shreve and her staff. Thanks are also due to you, Chairperson White, the committee members, and the City Council for their efforts to continuously improve the district's rent control system, which makes the district a nationwide leader in rental housing regulation. Finally, I extend my deepest gratitude and appreciation to the RAD team for their work ethic, diligence, and commitment to public service and our stakeholders. Thank you for your time and consideration, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much. We've been joined by my Ward 3 colleague, Matt Fruman. Councilmember Fruman, do you have an opening statement?
I'll do a brief opening statement as a part of my questions.
You can jump right into questions after that. Would you like to go first? You can
go first.
All right. Well, I do want to start by thanking both of you for your ongoing work. We work with both your offices a lot, and I think call on the Office of Tenant Advocate quite a bit to understand various issues and to get assistance for residents. So I do appreciate the work that you both do. For Ms. Shreve, a big part of what OTA does is education and outreach, and you discussed some of that in your opening statement. How has OTA's education and outreach changed over time?
Oh, it's changed a lot since the beginning. I mean, we've created podcasts. We have a social media on YouTube. We have 8 to 10 tutorials that we provide on a consistent basis. We've added 2 staff to the E&O branch, which is a very minor creation considering we have 8 wards. But they are robust. I mean, when I say they, the staff is extremely robust, very committed, and very talented in providing services to the community. They've created this mentorship program, which is new, and we are looking forward to developing, as I indicated in my testimony, a welcoming program that we will launch out into the tenant associations, because I believe the complaints we hear about individuals moving into our Northwest Corridor come with a variety of challenges. One is the diverse differences in culture. And I believe that when individuals move into a community, they should be welcomed into the community. And welcomed is defined in many, many different ways. A mother with 4 children living in Northwest doesn't know her way around, doesn't know the bus services, doesn't know where the schools are, doesn't know where she's going to shop. Someone needs to say, welcome to this community, and let us show you and help you to become comfortable in that new environment, as opposed to, oh, they're in our community. We have to change the way people embrace one another. And it's become much more difficult since everybody communicates by phone. So I believe that there has to be a way that we can engage and assist tenants in moving into new neighborhoods and understanding the culture of those new neighborhoods in a way that's productive for both sides of the conversation. So that's one of the things, and one of the changes, or not changes, but additions that we will be making to the E&O branch.
You talked a bit in your testimony about your vision for the future, and in that discussion, you mentioned an increase in the number of building closures. Are those buildings that have been closed by Department of Buildings?
That is correct.
Okay. And your recommendation there is for grants, I guess, ultimately for building owners. Is that right?
Let me back up a moment on that. I'll use this as a proposed name, which is the Housing Provider Reimbursement Program. As I indicated, we had spent over $1.8 million in the last 3 years on providing accommodation services to those who become temporarily homeless. As it relates to closures, what we're looking at is non-compliance on the part of the housing provider community and ensuring the habitability of their buildings. And so we as a government have been very gracious to provide those slumlords with subsidy for their tenants when we put them in hotels. My recommendation now is that we provide the housing provider with a choice. You can either pay that bill when your tenants are moved out of the hotel, or we will bill you for that particular financial expenditure by government. You have 30 days to repay the government, and if you don't, we will lien your property. The government should be recouping its investment, not providing housing providers who are failing to comply with building code provisions and putting tenants in harm. They should have to repay us our funds.
I like that idea.
And then also looking at the building closures. When I sat on the strike force some years ago and proposed the preservation program, the intent was to assist small builders, really, small homeowners, small housing providers, in upgrading their properties. And I think that in addition to loans, we should look at grants that we could provide to go in and do the energy upgrades, replace the wiring, replace the piping, put the new roof on the building, put the property in the 21st century, and then we put a covenant on the property, let's say for 10 years. So what we've done is to expand and to extend affordability. We don't have to increase the rents if we give them a grant. If, as an example, they sold the property 5 years into that program, they would be required to pay the initial investment that we made in the property. But I believe it would be a way for us to generate more activity with the preservation program. We would be able to look at those building closures to determine the commonalities of why those buildings are closing. I have already had, I sent an email to Director Hanlon requesting participation on the part of the Department of Buildings. We will have our first meeting next week on November the 9th to begin to continuously talk about it. I have not set up a meeting with Director Green over at DHCD to talk about modification, if possible, of the preservation program. But I believe that this would give us as a city a whole new program in which, yes, we make the investment, but there's a return on the investment. And at the same time, we identify where we can assist those housing providers who need the capitalization and also keep rents at a low rate so we have affordable units in areas around the city. To me, it's a win-win.
I appreciate that. I hope you'll keep us posted and let us know if you need any assistance there. My view is that we have not focused enough on preservation, focused more on creation of housing, but lack of focus on preservation is what leads to displacement. These buildings eventually become unlivable. As folks get moved out, I think they are unlikely to find another place in DC, and I think that's one of the reasons we see continued displacement. Do you track tenant complaints by building owner or management company?
Not at this time.
Okay. We get the committee gets just, I mean, a significant number of condition complaints, and I'm starting to try to wrap my head around how we track them to see commonalities. Like, owners and building management folks. But let me talk for in my last minute and a half in this round about policy changes that have come already. If you had to name one policy change during your tenure at OTA that was most impactful for tenants, what would that be?
It was the Tenant Bill of Rights.
And do you see enough enforcement around the Tenant Bill of Rights for it to be impactful as more than a document?
What I do know is that the housing providers are complying with the requirement. And that's based on the notion that when we receive an ATD, as an example, and our staff says, provide us with your lease, and we get the lease with the attachment. So we know that they are adhering to the district's requirement that tenants be provided with that, and it must be attached to the lease. So that's one way. When the E&O branches are out and they talk to the tenant community, they do talk about, do you receive the Tenant Bill of Rights at the time that you receive an application? Because I think it's extremely important, although it's probably at a time when the tenants are more focused on, I'm looking for a place to live, and not necessarily the attachments, all of the paperwork that they receive. But we do know that that particular policy and bill have been effective in the city. And we also know that it is something that other cities have actually lifted our entire Tenant Bill of Rights and created it in, let's say, the city of Chicago and in New York. Places are beginning to use it and finding out how we actually got that particular legislation enacted.
Okay, and you're suggesting that housing providers, by and large, follow the Bill of Rights respect?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilmember Fruman.
Thank you very much, Chairman White. And thank you to our witnesses. This is an incredibly complicated and incredibly important area. And so information is going to be key for all of us. I think the work that you all are doing is great. You both sort of talked about missing information, and I'm wondering, you spoke, Administrator Pear, about the database, which is a thing that I think we've all been watching for a while and maybe expected sooner. And the way you talked about it made me think that our wait is a little longer than I had expected it to be. So when do you think that we will be able to see and work with that database? What's your target date right now?
My target date is now, my personal target date, but we are constrained by programming considerations. As you mentioned, Councilmember Fruman, this program is incredibly complex, and it's more than just a database. We're trying to automate aspects of the business process. So it takes the human element out of it to the extent where if there's something that's very straightforward, a transaction, it's very straightforward, the system can just process it without constant human, having to review, cross-check between different systems and the like. So it's taken a long time. We worked diligently through COVID. We met, we were meeting anywhere from 10 to 15 hours a week on development. So Director Green is intent on, having the database released as soon as possible. There's still some programming features that are still ongoing. So we're aiming for spring of next year.
Spring of next year.
Yes, and sooner if Director Green has her, is able to, implement some of the plans that she has in place. So I'm just basing that off of what I've been told by my programmer. But we're honestly doing the best we can. The only thing I can do is implore that the council and the public be patient with us as we go through this process. I think it's going to be a fantastic system, and it's really going to change how we administer rent control for the city. And hopefully, we intend for it to be the best process that we can do for stakeholders and taxpayers.
So I hear you on that. I mean, you can imagine, I think you experience that as a disappointment. I experience that as a disappointment. It's not blaming anyone. It is a complicated endeavor, but the sooner that we can get to a complete database, the better equipped we are to take action in this area. And, last year we had the legislation capping the increases in rent, and I felt like we were operating a little blindly because we didn't have as much information as we needed. I think what we did was right and important, but we're in a position where we're making decisions with limited information. And so the sooner we can get that information, the better. There's a different category of information. It may relate. I may want to come back on the building closures. There are reports on income and expenditures for each rental housing provider. I've wondered what's the rate of return that our housing providers are earning. And I've been told that every year they must submit a report on their income and expenditures that would then show. Do you have that kind of information?
No, I mean, when a housing provider of a rent controlled building registers, they're required to report the rate of return on their registration form that they're making currently at the time of registration. But there's no other reporting mechanism for them to do a yearly kind of report to the rental accommodations division. So that's a paucity. That's information that we don't have on hand. So I can tell you what the rate of return is at the time of registration. 4 or 5 years after registration, that's not something that we have on hand.
And I mean, that seems like important information for us to know when we're having conversations about whether or not rent should be increased or not. What's already the rate of return? You do see rates of return when people make a petition for an increased rate. Is that a rental
So the
rate?
Rental Housing Act provides for a 12% rate of return. So if, which is, which goes back to 1985. So if a housing provider is not netting or, receiving a 12% rate of return, they can file a hardship. They can go through the hardship petition process where they submit financial statements, rent rolls, about the building, their operating costs, their capital costs, and we send it to, we have an auditor look at the petition and help us in our decision about whether or not the housing provider is meeting that 12% rate of return.
And those petitions come to you?
Yes, they do.
And how often do you get those petitions?
We haven't seen that many of them lately. I should have checked before I came, but this year I believe we've had about 4, maybe 5. So during my tenure as rent administrator, we haven't had that many overall.
And when it's 12% rate of return, 12% over what? What 12% of what is the rate of return? The capital invested in the building?
It's operating costs. It's all the costs to operate. It's capital costs. It's operating costs. It's, their mortgage loans, taxes. It's all considered.
So it's that their income is more than 12% greater than their operating costs.
Than their expenses overall.
Than their expenses overall.
Right.
And I guess I've heard that one reason why there might not be that many applications is that the process is very complicated. Or, I mean, how would you describe the process?
So I've never been on the end of having to prepare a petition. So from my perspective, I don't see them as very complicated. I mean, it's information that a housing provider should be gathering and keeping to operate their business. I mean, running a rental housing accommodation is a business. And so you should have your statements, you should have your operating costs, you should have the expenses. And you fill out a petition, you show your rent roll, you show your various types of costs, make the calculation of what you are asking for and send it in. I don't think it's overly complicated. Then again, as I said, I haven't been on the end of preparing it, but.
Yeah, I would very much like to see that data and know that you don't have that data, but I mean, I think a takeaway assumption is that all but 4 housing providers in the city were making more than 12% rate of return last year.
That's one conclusion. I don't know if that, if you can make a broad forecast. One thing I will say that I've noticed on the few that I have worked on is that usually the property, the rate of return to bring the rents up to the 12% rate of return is a significant increase. And I don't know if that is because the housing provider hasn't kept the property up to the point where it's, where it should be operating, collecting the rents, and keeping up maintenance. So sometimes we see 60-70% increases in rents to bring it up to the 12% rate of return. And that's pretty significant. And it's a hard hit for folks, particularly if they're lower income or moderate income.
I'm going to stay on this, and I guess I anticipated only doing one round, but I think I'm going to do 2 rounds. A different thing is when a landlord makes a substantial improvement and then they petition for an increase in the rent based on that investment. Can you describe to me how that process works and how often you're seeing those kinds of things?
I mean, there's actually 2 types of, there's capital improvement petitions, which is when they're making a capital improvement, I think is defined under the Internal Revenue Code, like a roof or boiler system. And there's also what's substantial rehabilitation, which I think is the cost is, and forgive me for I'm having a little bit of a memory lapse, if the cost is 50% more of what the building is actually worth. I think I've only seen 1 substantial rehabilitation during my term as rent administrator. I've seen several capital improvement petitions, but we don't review those capital improvement petitions at that point because of the change in the law in 2006. My office doesn't adjudicate capital improvement petitions. We are the intake point. We make sure they're technically complete. We send them on to the Office of Administrative Hearings to adjudicate the petition. But again, the petition process to me is not completely different from the hardship petition process. You're putting together reports of why the capital improvement is necessary, the cost, the time frame, and assemble that information.
And the threshold for the rehabilitation is that it's 50% of.
I may need to get back to you. I don't want to completely misstate it. Like I said, I've only done 1 and it was on vacant. I think it's 50% of the worth of the building, the value of the building.
Yeah.
And even on substantial rehabilitation petitions, we only adjudicate the ones where the units are vacant. If the units are occupied and a housing provider wants to do a substantial rehabilitation, those are adjudicated by the Office of Administrative Hearings.
Great. All right. Well, my time is up. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman. I appreciated those questions. One follow-up, and I'm not sure who's most appropriate to answer it, but this abuts the last conversation we were having, Ms. Shreve. How can you or we determine whether buildings are falling apart because a landlord is trying to keep rents low versus when they are acting as a slumlord?
I don't think it matters to us as a government. We have a strict requirement, habitability. The reason I'm more focused on the building closures, the fact that we had 104 in 22 and then 134 in 23 suggests that we have buildings that are falling apart. And so I want to engage with the Department of Buildings to and a partnership so that we can begin to look at what's causing these buildings to be closed. And that would tell us in many instances whether or not we have buildings that housing providers own that they have deferred maintenance to the point where the building is collapsing in a lot of different ways, and what needs to be done to bring those buildings back to life. And I think this is a way for us as a government to begin to answer the question that you just asked me. How do we know whether or not it's because, and we have some housing providers that we work with that keep the rents low, but they also don't do any maintenance to the property. So you can't be in the business of real estate, particularly multifamily real estate, and not maintain a property. It's an asset that you must invest a return of income into to assure that the asset maintains its value. And if you don't, then you end up with what we see on a regular basis and here, ceilings that are collapsing and rodents getting in and appliances not being updated and energy efficiency not happening. So the cost of doing business increases because you have not maintained that structure, that asset in a way that was intended when you purchased it.
So if someone buys an older building with the best of intentions and building needs a new roof, starting to show real signs of age, not collapsing, and they are faced with the prospect of needing to do major upgrades and overhauls, but recognizing that the cost of that may displace some, if not most, of the residents there. You don't think we should make a distinction between that building owner and say as a bottom feeder who bought a building in bad condition, knowing it was in bad condition, not intending to put any resources into it, but to really pull money out and hand it off to the next person? Should we not see a distinction between those two landlords in terms of what assistance we might provide through a grant program or even enforcement?
On the basis of enforcement, I think everybody's at the same place. On the basis of whether you loan or you grant the dollars, you can make a differential difference between those two because you probably can see the difference between the type of landlords that you're dealing with. But the reality for us as a city is it's a property that needs to be updated and upgraded, particularly for the people that are living there. I mean, one of the problems we have with on the tenant side is that a tenant may not complain because they don't want the rents to be raised, but they're living in a hovel.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it could be a building where the owner recognizes, and I'll say, in buildings where seniors live, you may not hear from those seniors because they want a place to live.
Right.
But at what price and at what cost? I think that we have to take the posture as government. When we govern to ensure that everybody receives the same services from the government that we vow to provide. I don't want your grandmother to live in a building that has falling ceilings and the toilet doesn't work sometimes, or the water's turned off, or the number of complaints as I've gotten just last night on one property where the heat is not on. It is inexcusable in this day and age for a housing provider not to have a preventative maintenance program on any property that he or she owns. It is inexcusable that there are not replacement reserve accounts that deal with the useful life of all of the product on a property, whether it's the carpet, the refrigerators, the stoves, the lighting. I can take this building and
I've got a lot more questions I got to get to, so I can take your point on that.
But okay,
How did your legal team decide when they will represent a tenant or a tenant association as opposed to just providing advice or referring them somewhere else?
they look at the public interest impact of the request.
What does that mean?
Meaning, how is this something that's an individual issue, or is it something that's going to impact the tenants across the board?
Okay, so generally, if it impacts tenants across the board, or that's something that you would be more likely to take on.
Example, when we made the referral to the OAG on the discriminatory activities of the voucher program.
Got it.
Or when we took 4,000 masks because we knew there were some issues there. And we in my office actually represented in that case. Because we know that, as you well know, the amount of time that must be devoted to litigation versus just brief legal services can be tremendous based on the issue.
I want to start talking about performance measurement. You mentioned in your testimony that OTA has assisted tenants in recovering about $24 million through litigation, including settlements and damage awards since 2013. How has that amount changed over time? Is that amount going up, down, staying pretty consistent?
Well, as I indicated in 23, we had 383,000 some odd dollars that were given back. Those are handled by the attorney advisors when they are addressing the particular case, whether it be housing code violations that have been journalized and now we're looking to get a credit back to the tenant versus the case that came into the paper last night where the Attorney General's office is now suing housing providers for this fraudulent rent increase program that they are in collusion with a software company that was able to show them how to increase rents across the board.
So with these types of settlements and damages, this could be, a couple significant suits, or it could be many smaller ones. Do you track the success rate of your legal branch in court cases they participate in?
Yes.
And do you see any trends there?
In terms of the commonalities of the issues?
Success rates for cases.
For those that they end up doing representation for, we've been fairly successful. We have not assumed, because we don't have the staff capacity to do so, we were somewhat refrained from getting into the litigation area because we just don't have the staff for it, not with the amount of daily input that we receive, which runs between 140 and 180 calls a week. And the notion there is about an hour and a half per case. There's just no way to do both and serve. And we do handle and resolve every case that we get in. So we haven't just had the opportunity to create that litigation branch, although I keep pressing for it. We just don't have enough people to handle that right now.
And what about measuring the outreach? You mentioned in your testimony that OTA has helped countless thousands of residents understand and pursue their rights, which is, I know, wonderful. And when a residents testified to that great service, does OTA follow up with tenants that you've worked with to see if they've reached their goals, or have any other way of sort of measuring the success beyond just the number of people that you present to?
I asked that question of Cristobal before I came. And what he said was, when we're dealing with tenant associations, usually once we've gotten them to the point of, they've gotten they're now certified as a tenant association, and we help them in moving to that level, they pretty much back away from us unless they need something. Usually tenants will organize based around an issue, as we all know. So in a lot of instances, such as particularly if there's TOPA, and I am sort of bracing for what I perceive to be a TOPA onslaught in 24 with the Petra properties, which your office was kind enough to inform us about. We're talking 15 properties that are going to be up for sale. And we did a search from the first two that were sold that we didn't know anything about. And I'm very disturbed about that because we have the rapid rehouse program where we are notifying tenants about their rights, particularly as it relates to TOPA. And we have pictorials and we have training, we have everything set aside. And right now we're at Tacoma Flats working with that tenant association group because we were called by the attorney that's representing them to do what we had done when Tacoma Flats became Tacoma Flats. So we see the need for continued education and outreach going out because it does appear there is some change in the marketplace as it relates to the development community.
I appreciate it. We've gotten a lot of complaints about Petra, so I appreciate your attention there. Councilmember Fruman.
Yeah, I'm just going to briefly follow up on that because can you describe what this is, this onslaught of TOPA cases related to Petra? Clearly the chairman knows about it, but I'm sitting here and
I'm not sure yet. We are just in the throes of identifying all of the properties that they have in their portfolio. We were notified by a tenant that one of the property was sold, which I had my staff who does the rapid rehousing to look back to see if we had been notified. We had not, because we did not. So there were two properties that got sold, where we had no involvement with ensuring that the tenants have their rights
I
protected.
see. So
But we know that they've made it clear that they're selling their portfolio. So now we're going to be revving up to start a process with those properties.
okay. Have either of you reviewed the new rent reasonableness tool that's being used by DCHA in the voucher context?
The Office of Tenant Advocate has reviewed it. My policy staff and I met with several housing providers who are very actively engaged with DCHA. The process, as I understand it, they've sort of gotten into lockstep with the HUD definition, but I'm not sure yet what that really means. I mean, it means that they're complying because they had to comply. And I'm not just sure yet about the impact of it.
This is the thing, we're trying to understand it and we hear different things and we hear that the numbers are dynamic, frankly, because as more data gets entered into the system, then it changes what the output is in terms of what would be a reasonable rent in a particular area. But this is the thing we're going to want to track closely to make sure that it's accurate.
Well, with the 187% that they're using as the basis, that's a problem. You know, they elected that 187% increase. So I don't know how you get to rent reasonableness if you are at the same time saying that the rents could reach up to 187% of the AMI. I don't, the two don't sit in the same room with me.
Okay, well, let's at a different time review that more closely together. A different dimension to that is there may be for each area a figure for a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom. And one of the phenomena that we're seeing, and maybe I'd be curious if you see, is apartments being chopped up. So you had an apartment that was a 1-bedroom that turns into a 2 or 3-bedroom. So the square footage is a 1-bedroom square footage, but nominally it's a 2 or 3-bedroom apartment now and it gets a much higher rent. Are you seeing that phenomenon?
Well, South Van Ness did that 6-8 years ago.
And are you continuing to see that, or
I haven't seen it as of late. We know that it has happened. And I don't know how you would take a 1-bedroom and turn it into anything more than a 1-bedroom, because usually a 1-bedroom is no more than 650 square feet. So that you're talking about two studio apartments or
well, you split the bedroom in half and you have two. I was in a building where it was there were 2 bedrooms and they were very, very small, barely
Right.
a room for a bed and almost nothing else.
right.
And I don't know whether you're monitoring whether apartments shrink, bedrooms shrink so small that they shouldn't be considered a 2-bedroom, that they should be considered that's a way of gaming the system that is adverse to tenants, in my opinion. But are you seeing that?
No, I haven't seen that, and I'm assuming that the occupancy standards for the city, the occupancy standards and the square footage should have some correlation to one another. So, no, what
Oh.
you're saying to me is actually something I'm not aware of, and I have not heard complaints about that.
Okay. I think, I think for now, I mean, some of your testimony about the building closures and the chairman's questions about trying to differentiate between different folks in that setting is important. And I don't know how we'll solve it. I don't think we're going to solve it in this hearing. But the idea that somebody could have a building, it gets run to the ground, they have not done the preventive maintenance, they've been just taking money out for a long time, and then it gets to the place where DOB closes it. How do we approach that person as opposed to somebody who's really been trying and been making the investments, or hasn't been making any meaningful income off of the building and it's gotten run down? How you help those different players would be different. But from your perspective, you have a tenant who's living in a building that's become uninhabitable. And so we need to address it. The mechanism for helping them, I think, is different depending on the good faith of the operator.
It wasn't a consideration I thought about because I dealt with the fact of it's uninhabitable. Who and why became, I haven't thought about it in the context that you and the chairman have raised with me, because I'm looking at the fact that we as a government have spent almost $2 million in 3 years on providing temporary housing for those who have become homeless. So mine is, how do I get a return on that investment back into the city as our revenues are decreasing operationally? Am I going to save the emergency housing program?
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. And so, but what you raised and you point to areas of potential solutions, and it's very important testimony. Really grateful for that testimony. Then we need to think about what kinds of things we might be able to do in that area. And then I think whether it's a loan or a grant, whether or not there's an element that's punitive, in part would turn on what the activity of the landlord in the run up to that has been. But we need to dwell on that for the moment. I want to thank you both for your testimony. I very much want to see that data. Hopefully we can get it out there as soon as possible, because that's going to be important in informing things that we can do. Thank you very much for your testimony and your service.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman. Has the number of lawyers, how has the number of lawyers at OTA increased over the recent years?
It has not. We have 8. I think we have 8. We had 2 positions that would have increased it to 10 with the ARPA money, but we gave those 2 back because the diversion of evictions was not something that we were going to be working on. So we didn't fill those 2 positions. Then when we had 2 attorneys leave, and we've now filled those back. So we have a complement of, I believe it's 8. Council member.
Okay.
But I'll make sure that we get you the actual number. I think it's 8.
Okay. I'd like to understand over the past 4 years, how many attorneys you have and how many cases you take on, just so I can look at trends. Do you track any performance indicators that you can share with the committee to help you gauge where the agency is, but also where the city is?
The city is on?
In terms of whether conditions are worsening for tenants.
In terms of where they live, in terms of management versus tenants?
In terms of living conditions.
My answer on the latter is I have not. In terms of the city, we don't have a measuring stick for that. We did have a survey that we did with every tenant who entered our office to ask them whether or not the services provided and the and the recommended actions has that answered and served what you came here for. And so it was a voluntary survey that the tenants could fill out after their interview with the tenants. I mean, excuse me, with the attorney advisors. What we are planning once we move is to add that to the telephone and to our technology so that we can find out pretty rapidly whether or not we provided you with the service that you came here for. That's very important to me to know, are the staff doing the right thing? I mean, are we giving the tenants what they're asking us for? And now you can do a lot of this by phone and or by by phone is usually the way it works.
What are the key metrics you use to determine your agency's performance year over year?
I look at the number of cases that we take in. Have we resolved 100% of those cases? How many have we referred out to nonprofit legal service providers? The types of cases that we are handling. Obviously, in terms of our educational stuff, I'm looking at, are we reaching the community? What tools are we using to reach the community? Emergency housing pretty much speaks for itself. We're housing 100% of the people that find themselves in a temporary homeless situation based upon our involvement in the Homeland Security overall program. And so I guess I haven't put a B, or C performance on each one of the branches, but overall, I believe that our mission statements are the basis for, those are my objectives. And then I look to see whether or not the strategies that we've employed are meeting those objectives.
Do you have any thoughts on this? I think is clearly a gap. I get a lot of complaints as chair of the housing committee about building conditions. Some of these issues have been going on for a long time. Marbury Plaza is one that comes to mind. They're not alone in this, where tenants are living in poor conditions while agencies try to figure out how to address the issues, and even addressing it sometimes means putting it into receivership, but receivership doesn't necessarily result in better living conditions. So I find myself wishing we had more or different tools. Do you have any thoughts on what we can or should be doing to help residents living in buildings with chronically poor conditions to improve their state of living?
We've been dealing with Mulberry Plaza since 2008. I negotiated their rent strike deal with the management company then, way back when. Peter Nichols was the AG at that time. We continue to see that property sold. Basically, a New York finance mafia up there has flipped that property around. I don't know how many times. UIP managed it for a while. It's I think the city should become more demanding about you, and you raised this already, about who do we allow into our city to manage housing. I mean, I think we've seen a variety of players come into the District of Columbia, and on that particular property, to be exact. And the answer continues to fail both us and to the tenant community. That property was as you well know, it was a middle-class Black panacea back in the day. This is where everybody wanted to live. And then over time, it just became a property that wasn't being maintained properly. And it has gone into where it is now. And I think they are getting ready to look at receivership on them now. I think, because I think the OAG is involved in it now. I mean, we were involved with the Tenant Association. In fact, one of my employees lived at Mulberry Plaza.
Hmm.
So we had intimate knowledge about how it was being maintained, what was going on there. I personally probably attended 10, 15 meetings at that property over the course of time. The Woodner is another one that we are looking at a major capital improvement now. We're talking 1,000 units. Huge, another place where folks partied and the whole thing. And now it's an international in and out.
Yeah. These are significant issues. Mulberry Plaza and the Woodner. These are massive buildings
Yeah.
where you have a lot of everyday people living there, and I worry a lot. I know you worry a lot about their displacement. I mean, that's massive displacement.
Yeah, that's not something, maybe this is a DOPA talk discussion. Maybe it's time for the city to take it over and to buy it and to put management in and to nurture it back to health. I mean, there's the question of how DOPA is being used in the city is still a question to me. I mean, we have it on the books, but we haven't utilized it
Not a single time.
to really address the kinds of concerns that you and I are talking about right now.
Right.
So the question is, how do we get there and really make a statement about we're not going to stand for this anymore. We want people to live in quality housing. And how do we do that if we continuously allow the property to be owned by out-of-towners? Because every time it's either been New Jersey or New Yorkers that have owned this property. So their commitment is not to the District of Columbia.
Right.
And so when do we say, let's invest our own dollars in it and bring it back and demand that what the original idea was to give it some if we're improving other areas of the city, why aren't we improving this?
Right. And prevent in a way that would prevent displacement, because again, when we cut a ribbon on a new building, it's usually new folks, and I'm glad they can come, but the more we're not paying attention to preservation, the more we are, I think, accepting displacement of people living in bad
Or
conditions.
we're pushing the community out by not saying we are committed to the preservation of historical properties that have been in the city for 50 years or more. I mean, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies to our public housing stock. I hope that the new director will think about inviting the home builders in to assist them to bring those properties back. Because they have the capabilities and the skill sets to do that. And because I worked for the home builders, I know what I speak to. I mean, this is not something in the sky. It's something that can happen. A public-private partnership of that case would be dynamic to help bring those properties back. The city has invested, what, 1 year, 25 million, another year, saying, where is our investment dollars? What have we gotten back for the money that we've invested?
There you go.
Conversation is not what we're looking for. We're looking for quality housing for people in the community so that they can stay.
Let me ask you one other question that it's not something I would have thought of, but for the fact that this is an issue that's now come up twice within the past week. We've gotten calls from children who were caregivers of their adult parents. One was a voucher holder, the other not. But the parents passed, and now they are
They
being
have to
evicted
move from the unit.
within days.
Yes.
And there are, sometimes circumstances that prevent a, quick move. People who are not working and sometimes able to work. Is this something you see a lot of, and is it something you have thoughts on how we can assist these folks?
Well, the first part is the educational part. If you don't know the rules, you can't play the game. So if you live in a public housing unit, you have federal law in place. You're not on the lease. My mom is 70 years old and I moved in to help her now. I'm the caretaker. Mom needs to put you on the lease. It's called a change in family household composition. It's a very easy thing to do, so that when mom dies, you are now listed as a household member. He's 59 years old. His mother was 72 and she passed. He's in poor health. I have it on my desk. I know exactly the case that you speak of. It's not the first one. 90% of the time, it's because there's a failure to understand the rules of engagement. Just as we teach Renters' Rights 101, it appears now I'm going to have to start teaching the Section 8 rules also, which I used to do a long time ago at the National Conference of Home Builders. I mean, when I was with the partnership. I was the vice president of training there, and we had every HUD program you could mention. If the family does not change the household composition in a recertification, then that person who has moved in and it's been living there for the last 10 years is not considered a resident of that household.
It'd be ideal if more people, and ideally everyone, knew these rules, and I think there's some work that we have to figure that out. But should we consider changes in law that give folks some reasonable amount of time to figure out their living situation? What I'm hearing for the case that came to me yesterday is they've been asked to leave in days.
Yes.
I mean, no one can most people can't find a place to live in days.
You're absolutely correct, council member. I empathize with that particular gentleman like I've done with the others that have been also, when I've made calls and said, can't you give them 30 days or 2 months to figure it out? I would imagine that the director of the housing authority could do such. Why they're not doing it, I'm not sure, since they have vacancies that they're not filling. Why is it such an important one to take that guy or that woman out of that unit? But you're talking about now adding to a federal requirement, and I think that there could be some waiver requests made by the housing authority for consideration, or are we doing as well a good a job as we should do when we're dealing with recertification of Section 8, project-based and or voucher tenants? I mean, I think that those are things that lie with the administration and the implementation of the programs on the part of that particular, of the authority.
Right. This will be, I'm pretty sure, my last question for you. My team is in touch with your team just about every week on policy issues. A lot of things are crossing your desk. A lot of things are crossing our desks. Where do you think the committee should focus its legislative work over the next year? We take feedback.
You're asking, it's like this is Christmas. You're asking me to tell you. I mean, there's a variety of areas that I think we would like to see. Well, let me say this. I'm not gonna say a specific today, because what happens when we do ATDs and inputs, and this is very interesting, when we're living the legislation, the statutes, this is when the nuances of how that statute should pan out should actually be. And there are some areas that where operationally, I think a tweak in the statute would help. And so on that front, I'd like to withhold an answer today and provide you with in the next several weeks. Here's the laundry list of things that I think the committee should consider. because there are some very specific things that I know that staff and I have talked about, and by you asking me that right now, and I didn't think about that as a question that I might get asked.
Yeah.
I don't have all of that written down in a cheat sheet. So let me provide you with what I consider to be short-term and long-term.
I'd appreciate that.
Because that way, maybe there are some, when you have the short-term successes, then you can wait on the long-term victories sometimes, but
Sometimes, yeah.
there are things that do need to be fixed, and on behalf of my colleague, I would say that the work that we did on the database was very dear to us. The amount of time we spent before we transferred it to Lauren Shop. And I know that they need financial support to to get across the finish line. So it's something that I'm sure will happen when we talk to you about budget soon. And in order to realize the goals that we all have for that system, I'm hoping that support can be shown. And I'll leave it at that.
I appreciate it. Well, I look forward to your thoughts and feedback on where we should be focusing. And we'll pick up on the rent control database with you, Ms. Pear. I appreciate your work and efforts on this. I just feel like we are finally so close to the finish line. We have got to cross it. As you know, the database is over 3 years past its September 2020 deadline. At this point, what prevented the agencies from meeting the original deadline?
I think it was actually the complexity of what was being asked. Honestly, I think that with all due respect to council, I don't think they understood the breadth and the scope of the different nuances in the act and the things that had to be covered. I mean, perhaps the vision, I wasn't there at the time and I was working the district in a different capacity. The vision was that it would be just a straight database, but we've made it into something more than that, trying to, as I said earlier, automate some of our processes, streamline things a little bit better, make it, a better tool overall, not only for, for people who are doing their transactions, but also as for policy making and decision making. So the Rental Housing Act, as I've come to learn, is a little more than a notion. It's a very complex piece of legislation, and it's just taken time to explain the workflows, the processes, the law to the vendor, have them translate that into code, however they do that. I am no computer science person. And it's just taken time to do it. And so that's why I said to Councilmember Fruin, if we can, I understand everyone's very anxious for it. No one is more anxious than I am, Chief Tenant Advocate Shreve and Director Green, to get this up and running. But we also want to make sure it's done right. There's no sense in rushing a product and then having glitches in it. So there's a lot that goes into it, not only from the programming side, from the law side, but also we have to do outreach, as you're aware, and make sure that this is launched properly.
I mean, it'd be difficult to say we're rushing anything because it's 3 years
I
overdue
understand.
now. From my conversations with DHCD and Department of Buildings, I'm hearing that we are finally near the finish line. When can the public expect to see the database?
I think I'm going to have to talk to my director and get back to you on it. As you know, she's proposed some pilot demonstrations, so at least we can show the public, show the council what we've achieved to this point. I mean, we do have data, we do have a working database. What we're trying to do now is do some data integration from the Department of Buildings, the Department of Consumer Licensing, consumer DLCP, licensing and consumer protection. Director Green has some ideas for some additional features that she wants added in. So, I mean, realistically, we're looking, I think, at spring 2024, and we'll do our best to see what we can do to, bring that up. But in that meantime, we also have beta testing planned. We want to launch a calendar of, for the public to follow as we, achieve some of these goals. But I think realistically, it's going to be in the spring.
Who will manage the database?
Right now, it's our Chief Information Officer at DHCD, and so I imagine it will remain in his shop. As I said, admitted I'm no computer science person. So I imagine it would have to be with our Chief Information Officer in consultation with Octo.
Let me move to something else, which is rent stabilization or rent control, as we usually call it. The rent administrator, you discussed this some in your testimony, is responsible for carrying out the rent stabilization program. Can you go back through what is your role in carrying out rent control in the district?
Well, the rent administrator heads the rental accommodations division. We're the ones tasked with the, the day-to-day operations of rent control, so to speak. We accept filings, we review them for technical completeness. We have established a repository of, of our registrations, our rent histories for buildings. We make sure that it's, that those transactions are completed correctly. We coordinate, so to speak, for lack of a better word, the petitions that come through, tenant petitions, some types of housing provider petitions, making sure that we transfer and channel those to the Office of Administrative Hearings for adjudication and disposition. The petitions that we do have authority to hear, we, examine those, we make determinations, issue administrative decisions. So just about every facet, we touch on it. We're just making sure, I guess, sort of, that we are the directors in terms of making sure the system operates and flows the way it's intended to do.
And what would you say is the biggest challenge in administering rent control?
Well, I hope this isn't impolitic of me to say this. The constant legislative changes that come from council. I understand that we're trying to make our program better, but I feel that there are times I get something in place and then we have yet another legislative change. So it does make it very challenging to stay on task and to, convey the information about legislative changes, change some of our business flows, our operations, our forms. So that to me has really been one of the hardest things for me to get my arms around. But on the other hand, I understand it's a competing interest, right? We want to make sure the system is efficient and works the best that we can devise it to do.
Well, we obviously, the council intervened in rent control this year because of record high inflation, which our rent increases are tied to. Other than that, what types of changes are coming from council that cause issues?
Well, this feels like it's there. To me, my perception is that it's just constant tweaking. Every session, it seems that we have a proposal to change some aspect of rent control. We go through the analysis of, how it's going to impact the program, if it's going to impact any kind of resources we may need. Sometimes the laws go into effect, sometimes they don't. The most recent one, for example, and it's very small, is, the change on the notices on the rent adjustment notices up from 30 days to 60 days.
Mm-hmm.
So in itself doesn't seem like a small thing, but this means that we have to change all our forms. I have to get them translated, and it has impacts on the database. That's just a very small example that I can think of off the top of my head. I can get back to you with other ones if you are interested.
No, excuse me, I'll take your point and
it's a ripple effect.
That's
right?
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does your office opine on policy, rent control policy changes?
We do not.
Why not?
Because that's not my role. My role is to be a fair, impartial, neutral party. And that's what decision maker, that's what I try to do to the best of my ability. If I find there's an aspect that's not working, then I can make a proposal for a regulatory or a law change. For policy kinds of issues, I usually refer them to the Office of Tenant Advocate. So no, we don't. We try very hard not to. That's not how I see my role in this program.
It's central to a bill introduced by Councilmember Fruman is the idea that providing market rate rent for people with vouchers, even in rent controlled units, um, cannibalizes the rent control stock. Is that a policy conversation to you, or is that a factual conversation? Do you have thoughts on that issue?
It is a policy. It is a policy discussion. I will tell you the one case, I can tell you what I observed in a particular building where, when you can draw your conclusions and, on it, is that there was a housing provider of a large building that allowed a large number of voucher tenants to move in, and then had a voluntary agreement circulated among the voucher tenants. So there was almost 70% of the voucher tenants who agreed to a rent increase because it really didn't impact them. But the rent controlled tenants were obviously deeply impacted by that.
Mm.
So I think there is some leveraging going on that council may want to examine, but I don't have an opinion on it. I can just tell you what I've observed.
I appreciate that. And you mentioned in a discussion with Councilmember Fruman that the city does not see a lot of hardship petitions. Is that right, from
At this
landlords?
time, I mean, I'm sure if there's some kind of economic change, we could possibly, if there's something that changes, that impacts housing providers' ability to, charge the rents that they're allowed to legally at this time, we could. But no, I have not seen a large number of hardship petitions.
Do you think would it make sense for your office to talk to landlords? I've heard reports that they're difficult. Councilmember Fruman, I think, mentioned that they're difficult. I have no idea. Is there a need, you think, to get feedback from housing providers on what, if any, difficulties they're having?
I think feedback is always good. If there's a way to improve something, we should have, and it's within our ability to do it. We should, we should always have the discussion and then see what we can improve. So yes, I mean, I feel, sometimes I sit, in an ivory tower, so to speak, because when I see things come in, it doesn't look that difficult to me. But like I said, the experience of having to put something together is very different.
Yeah.
So I would be very happy to engage in discussions with folks that are having problems with it and seeing what we can do to improve it.
And when landlords do file a petition, what information do they provide as justification to your office?
Well, it depends on the petition type. I think we have like
For hardship?
5, right? For hardship.
Yeah.
That their expenses, their operating costs, capital costs, their debt is not yielding them the 12% rate of return that they're guaranteed, that's provided for in the statute. I mean, so that's really the justification. That's why we have an auditor involved. So they may come in and say, look, I am X% below, what would yield me 12% rate of return. We have an auditor go through all of them financial materials to verify that. And then they make a recommendation to my office. And from there we decide, whether it's justified.
Is the information that they submit to you, is it privileged in any way?
I tend to I believe in government transparency. Let me start off by saying that, but I am very wary about how much information is released. I feel like there is confidential information. There are taxpayer ID numbers, there are tenant names and contact information, there is the landlord's bank account information. So that type of information, the straight numbers, no, but the information that backs up those straight numbers could have some confidential information, which makes me nervous about releasing it to the public in general. When people who are not directly related to the transaction come to me and they, want information on a particular petition, I ask them to submit a Freedom of Information Act. But if it's a tenant that comes and they want to see the hardship petition, I will give them a copy. They're entitled to it. They're entitled to see a copy of it, but I will redact out taxpayer ID, some types of personally identifiable information, bank information, and so forth.
Okay. I ask that because when tenants come to us and say, you know, the burden, the rent burden is too high. We need help. We take that seriously. When landlords come to us and say, you know, we don't bring in enough money to operate, I take that seriously too. Getting data to back that claim up has been difficult over the years. And one of the things I'm interested in doing, because I want to create good policy here, is to see the data that supports these arguments. So that's kind of where that line of question comes from. What are the most, so you are responsible as rent administrator for reviewing rent adjustment petitions for landlords seeking to change rent in stabilized units. You also review tenant complaints about petitions? Is that
No,
right? No.
those, and I only review some of the housing provider petitions. Some
Okay.
of them we keep. Most of them, I would say, go to OAH, go to the Office of Administrative Hearings. Tenant petitions, same thing. We are the intake point for the tenant petitions. We review it for technical compliance, make sure, for example, we have their contact information, a copy of proof of their tenancy, you know, right? If the supporting documentation, if they have it at that point in the transaction. But we just make sure the minimum, you know, is there, and then we transfer it to the Office of Administrative Hearings and they adjudicate the matter.
Okay. Do you, in the intake process, track the types of complaints?
Yes, we do.
What are the most common types of complaints you receive?
Truthfully, I have not looked at lately. For security deposits is one that comes to mind, but I don't know. I'd have to get back to you on that. I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay. If you would get back to us, I would appreciate it. You or Ms. Shreve may have some understanding. One of the complaints I've started receiving a lot, and I don't have the independent information on, is that people looking to rent apartments have suggested to me that some landlords are only accepting people with vouchers and that they are screening people out at the front end, sometimes telling them, you know, if you don't have a voucher, you're not likely to get it. Is that something either of you are hearing these days?
I haven't seen that.
We know that there is income discrimination going on with regards to that. Some housing providers are focusing specifically their business model on the subsidized side. And one of the concerns I have there deals with poverty concentration. And I explained that to housing providers. We are not looking for Cabrini Greens, Pruitt-Igos. We're not interested in all poor people being put in one property.
Yeah.
And when you start that kind of marketing model, that's you're begging another set of consequences that you're not prepared for.
Right.
So I think that we know that there are some housing providers, because we've met with them, who are focused in that area, and I have vocally informed them of my disfavor to that particular type of model, because I do believe it will bring us other kinds of consequences that they're not going to be able to handle.
Right. I agree. And what about screening income before someone can apply for a vacant unit? This is another complaint I've gotten a couple times recently. They were told that they had to provide proof of income before they could even apply for an apartment. Is this something that either of you have heard complaints about?
That one is new. I have not. Yeah, I have not heard. That could be another form of income discrimination.
Yeah. Okay.
And they should file, I would think, with the Office of Human Rights on those matters. I mean, why would you ask somebody to tell you, if you're asking about your ability to pay, you're going to get that when the application is completed. You don't ask that information. In other words, before we even bother with an application, we want to know how much money you make.
Right.
Yeah, I've not heard that.
Okay. I'm going to move to the relationship between your office, Ms. Pear, and Superior Court and MPD. The rent administrator is required to establish a formal relationship with the landlord-tenant branch of DC Superior Court. You mentioned some of this in your testimony, and with the Metropolitan Police Department. How do you work with Superior Court and MPD?
Well, I have, truthfully, I have not met with MPD since my tenure. I had a few meetings with the pro bono, the landlord tenant pro bono branch. I think there were also some Superior Court representatives there too. I think we met once or twice before the pandemic, but I haven't followed up on that.
Okay. So could we say that we need to strengthen the relationship between your office and particularly DC Superior Court?
Sure. Yes, I think that's fair.
I think that'd be helpful. Obviously, here on this end, more complaints from landlords about the slowness of the process at Superior Court. I hear this regarding serious health and safety issues with some landlords who said that folks have either threatened bodily harm to other tenants or in some cases discharged firearms, and they've had a difficult time evicting people, which has led to employees leaving and other residents being afraid. And so we're trying to understand how to best assist in particularly these severe cases.
I'm not sure how much influence I could have on Superior Court or even MPD, but if the landlords, if the housing providers want to contact, if you encounter a case like that, you can certainly put them in touch with my office and we'll see what we can do about facilitating. But I take your point about reestablishing a broader relationship, and I will try to take that up. I'm going to fall back on my database excuse that's really been we're a small staff. I have 2 attorney advisors and 6 contact representatives and 1 administrative assistant. I feel it's a pretty tiny staff for the amount of the volume of work that we handle and process. I'm not begging for resources or saying we're under resourced. I'm just saying that there's just a limit on just how much we can take on. But I take your point about reestablishing those relationships.
I appreciate it. And we will refer landlords to you in these more extreme cases
Sure.
to have a discussion. You have some discretionary authority as well. For instance, the law allows you to attend policy meetings of the Rental Housing Commission. Do you attend any of those meetings?
Not lately, I have not. But I do have a very strong working relationship, particularly with the general counsel. Not contact with the commissioners themselves is not, is a little bit limited, not from, any fault failing on my part or the commission's, I think they're called administrative judges now. But I do have a very strong relationship with the commission through their general counsel.
Okay.
And a very cooperative one as well.
Excellent. And you also have authority to issue advisory opinions on issues of first impression. Is that something you do?
I have not had the occasion to do that yet.
Okay. And finally, for discretionary authorities, you are permitted under law to hold hearings, administer oaths, and require the attendance and testimony of witnesses and the production of documents to carry out your functions. Are those authorities that you use?
I have not used them during my tenure now.
Okay, why not?
And the occasion hasn't presented itself to me.
Okay. You mentioned the size of your staff, which is something I was going to ask about. But let me ask about 2 things here. One, how do you evaluate whether the work of the agency is successsul?
Well, I can't evaluate the agency. I feel like my
sorry,
function and my objective is a little bit different from the agencies. Really, I think my primary measure is in customer service. I want to make sure that when, I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but we we intake a lot of phone calls on a daily basis. I mean, there've been times when I've been short-staffed and I've done it myself and I've answered 30 to 40 phone calls in one day. And so I want to make sure that people walk away with, if we can't help them directly, with resources, where they need to go to get the information or the assistance that they need. I've observed my staff, I watch them, and they really go to the nth, the nth degree. They'll say, let me make a few calls for me, for you. I'll get back to you. So customer service to me is paramount, and making sure, as Johanna, as a chief tenant advocate described, and people having information is, helps them in their situation and in their community. So that to me is my paramount measure. Making sure that, I don't receive a lot of customer complaints about not not getting service or what they needed. Now, sometimes we have to deliver information, we'll have to say we can't help you, and people are very dissatisfied with that, but that also happens as well. So that is my chief measure. And then also making sure that, people receive timely responses, whether they filed a petition or a transaction, that we keep the business moving along.
Okay. How many FTEs does your office have?
Including myself, 10.
Okay. Are you at full capacity now?
As far as I'm aware, the director has arranged for me to hire a paralegal specialist, so I'll be hopefully bringing that position on. So that will be a total of 11.
Have you had turnover in the office in the past year?
I have not. I'm very fortunate in that just about everybody that, about half of the staff have been with that division. I have at least 2 employees that have been with that division between 20 and almost 40 years. So no, they tend to come and stay. My 2 most recent hires were 2 years ago. So I would say that on average, it's probably people having at least 10 to 15 years with the rental accommodations division.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on, based on what you're seeing in your role, what you think the housing committee should be focused on over the next year?
Well, the one that principally comes to mind, and we're working on this now, as we want to propose some legislative amendments to facilitate the database implementation. So hopefully we'll be sending that forward, but I'm going to take a cue from my colleague here and say, I'd like to get my Christmas list together and wish list together and send it to you.
Okay, please do. I
Okay.
appreciate it. We will do everything we can to help and support on the database. I think if any requests come to the council, they're going to have to come with very clear timelines and very short timelines, because there's going to be a lot of frustration here for this conversation to come up again. But we do want to get it over the finish line. So we will be happy to work with you.
And Director Green is committed to doing that as well. She really is.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both for being with us and for your service to the city. Those are all the questions that I have at this time. I do want to thank our public witness for joining us. And I want to note that if others were not able to join us today, but would like to submit testimony for the official record, they may do so. You can submit written testimony until the close of business tomorrow, Friday, November 3rd, 2023. To learn more about the work of this committee in my office, please sign up for our newsletter at robertwhiteatlarge.com. With that, the business before this committee is concluded. The time is now 12:13 p.m. and this roundtable is adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you.